Yeah, so we are here today to talk about how to think about creative practices and how they relate to transformations and sustainable futures. And it's a really exciting day because we're going to have insights from two programs, and I will introduce the session today a little bit, and I'm just going to admit some more people. So we are going to be learning from two projects that are funded by the same Horizon 2020 funding, the AMASS project and the Creatures project. And these two projects engage with creative practices and transformation. Okay, I'm just going to keep admitting people in different ways, and it's going to be very, very interesting because both of these projects, and the speakers will introduce their work in more detail, of course, but both of these projects are engaging with creative practices and transformations, but sort of in a complementary fashion. So the AMASS project is very much focused on how do creative practices engage with publics and with how publics are impacted by creative practice and how this relates to transformation. Whereas the Creatures project focuses more primarily, at least so far, on practitioners and how practitioners engage with transformation from the perspective of practitioners, and also on governing and contextual actors. So those people who are involved in funding creative practices, those who are policymakers who may be connected to creative practices, networks that are connected to them. And what is very exciting about today is that we're really hoping to get some shared insights about how the work in the AMASS project and the Creatures project can sort of connect. And we hope that for all of you who are here, you'll be able to see some of those bridges, and we would love to hear from you about that as well in the different discussions and conversations. I'm just going to go out of full screen because we have a series of speakers today, and we'll start the session with, so we have about 10 minutes per speaker, and I will introduce every speaker as they come up, and we're alternating between speakers from the Creatures project and the AMASS project. And we'll start with a presentation in a minute by Sofia Lindström, and Sofia comes from the AMASS side of things, and then we'll sort of continue with the program. Sofia, we're a little bit early. Are you ready to start your presentation?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Joost.
All right.
So, yes, I would like to share my screen.
Exactly. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you. And I hope I can. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Thank you. So, as you said, my name is Sofia Lindström, and I'm from the Swedish School of Library and Information Science. And as you said, I'm part of the AMASS, which is an abbreviation of Acting on the Margins, Art as Social Sculpture. And this project aims at addressing aspects of social marginalization in Europe through arts and creative activities. So the focus is on social sustainability through arts and culture. And in the seminar, I will present the findings from a review of research literature. I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so I might sound a little raspy. I'm going to try to speak as clearly as I can. I will present the findings from a research literature in what we define as a broad field of the social impact of the arts. And the reason why it's important to define and map such a field of research is that since roughly the 1990s, there's an ongoing policy trend to sort of support the potential of the arts in addressing social marginalization. And it's increasingly forms the justification for public funding of the arts. And of course, the AMASS project is part of that trend. But the mechanisms, however, of the impact of the arts are still kind of unclear. And the research on the social impact of the art is very difficult to overlook. And that's why we did this study. We wanted to inform debates on the social effects of the arts and provide culture policy actors, and also scholars and artist researchers with insights into patterns in research. So we used a two-step analysis in mapping then this field. So we wanted to delineate and define the field, and we used the cohort analysis. And I'm going to go through this in more detail. And we also wanted to explore the research front through what methodology called bibliographic coupling. So these are both quantitative and qualitative analysis that we've used. So first we wanted to delineate the field, and we wanted to identify relevant databases and search strings and so on, and to generate more relevant hits, because first when we did our first search, we realized that we got a lot of irrelevant hits. So we limited the keywords within a PIO framework, and PIO is short for population, intervention, and outcome. And this is inspired by a model used in pilot studies for evaluation in nursing. And we did the following review protocols. So we've studied peer-reviewed articles in English available in the digital format, published between 1990 and 2019 in 10 different databases. And these were our search strings. I'm not going to go through them in more detail because we don't have the time, but after the removal of duplicates, we resulted in an amount of over 10,000 documents. So in the descriptive analysis, so we found that the top 20 journals, they are in the discipline of arts education, a lot of them. And also journals dedicated to research on theater and museums are at the forefront. And we can see also that in the number of retreat documents per year, that the research interest is augmenting. It has increased. So it's an expanding field. So we performed a cohort analysis to identify topical clusters within the documents, consisting of terms often found co-located in the text. So this is a way to understand patterns in research. And the visualization of the terms presented us thus with these three overarching themes. And we named these clusters based on the topic areas of conversation related. And the red cluster, thus, we found that is mainly concerned with issues of culture and society, such as the museum as an institutional space and its importance for nations and regions, for example. And the blue cluster thematizes issues of art and education. It typically deals with the experience of learning in formal setting. And lastly, the green cluster connects issues of art and well-being. And it is primarily focused on methodologies and techniques for measuring the use of art to improve well-being and health. And the visualization allowed us to understand how these clusters, they represent various epistemological and theoretical traditions, humanistic, social sciences, natural sciences. And these are overlapping, but they are disparate enough to speak of them as subfields. So in our second step, we wanted to map the research front. So in bibliometric theory, articles with similar references are related content-wise. If they cite similar references, it carries what we call like the symbolic content of the cited works. Sometimes this is used to determine best research, but we more wanted to understand how the field forms related content through citations. So we analyzed a subset of 974 articles from the set of initially identified articles obtained from Web of Science. And the following images visualizes the mapping of 9 clusters with regards to the most cited articles. And this overview told us that authors relate their work to others to form themes of research then. And we wanted to study this qualitatively, and we needed to define a set of articles for analysis that was, manageable within the time frame set of writing. We were 2 people who read these articles. And after overviewing the clusters, we found that the red and green clusters were most interesting for a qualitative analysis of the research front. The other clusters were excluded because the articles were not within our chosen scope. They were about topics like archaeology, biology, paleontology, and so on. And thus for the analysis, of a art's social impact, we did a qualitative reading of the top cited articles operationalized as those with 10 or more citations in the remaining clusters, and this was 42 articles. And we used the PI model again to define population intervention and outcomes to form a basis in which we could discuss the understanding of the social impact of the arts. And this wasn't always straightforward, but to sort of fit the articles into the PIO framework, but it helped us a little bit. So when it comes to populations, the most common is definitely children and young people in formal and informal learning settings. We also found unspecific or broadly defined populations such as adults or visitors. Professionals are written about a lot, and then less common are indigenous, minority people, immigrants, refugees, and disadvantaged, such as the homeless, for example. Interventions was a little bit more straightforward. We see art educational, formal learning settings. People are writing about theater, media, popular culture, museum activities, visual arts, and music. And when it comes to outcomes, we see that a lot of these articles, they are actually, what they want to achieve is a sort of theoretical methodological development. So they're very focused on bringing forward theories that are sort of maybe more interesting to the field itself and other researchers, and maybe reaching out to the public. But skills enhancement was also very common. And then we also found the impacts of the social on arts, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Foster moral behavior and ethics in audiences and participants, assessment evaluation, health well-being, and community empowerment identity. So the two analyses, they confirm each other very much, with the exception of the intended outcome to further conceptual and theoretical knowledge. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation here. In research on the social effects of the arts, marginalization issues are not a prominent theme, but it's definitely there, but it's definitely knowledge skills enhancements among children and young people. Then as a result of art, that is the most researched topic, so to say. And even though our reading wasn't evaluative, we still had, how do you say, our research glasses on when we were reading these articles. And some of the claimed effects were not tested, especially when claiming empathic responses from audiences. The populations were not surveyed, the effects were not tested. And we also ask ourselves if these results reflect social effects, or are there individual group effects? And this depends, of course, on how you theorize the links between micro and macro levels of impact, of course. But we would argue that when articles in the research field thematize social effects, they can be listed as the following: reaching the public agenda, achieving media response, influencing structural power, building indigenous identities, which is important for claims of land and heritage, social reproduction, often reflecting shape practices of dominant groups at the expense of the marginalized, inside museums, for example. Obscuring post-colonial realities, critical awareness, change behavior, and not only in the targeted group, but also within the researchers themselves and the professionals, and community empowerment. And some articles, as I said, discuss the social effects on art rather than the social effects of art, like how are globalizing trends towards interculturalism mirrored in national theater, for example. So the results of the analysis are that the articles also point to negative social effects of the arts. The arts can be used to silence marginalized voices, to evoke ethically problematic assumptions in production and dissemination of theater, for example, obscure and make light of colonial pasts. So I think that this result is important for policy because the arts are very often presupposed to always be good. And we also ask ourselves what studies are not what effects are not studied. And we find only one study that spoke of the enjoyment aspect of arts and culture as an important, as something important about arts. So studying the research front, it has provided us with interesting categories for understanding how the art social effects are conceptualized in research. And we hope that it can give a more nuanced understanding of the arts and cultural activities as a means to achieve social sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. And by the way, my apologies for only sort of half introducing you. I had to make some quick adjustments. But thanks a lot. That was really wonderful. Great to hear. Yeah, let's see if we can have some questions from the audience about the presentation. We have some time. We've started a bit early. Sandra, would you like to speak up?
I can speak up, but not showing my camera. I'm in bed. Sorry. Yeah, I would like to know if you had some indigenous co-author who could or authors who could help interpret the results. Like, what was the composition of your team for the review?
No, none of us are indigenous. We are all Swedes.
Yeah, this is very important, I think, because otherwise it helps from, that lens. If you're not indigenous, then it's very hard to do fair, I guess, interpretation. And I say this because I'm based in New Zealand, and here indigenous culture is really strong. And yeah, I mean, it's a different take on it. It's like we cannot write even sometimes, or we shouldn't write articles about indigenous without indigenous authors. But
I'm afraid I don't understand, because I haven't written about indigenous groups. I've written about research on the social effects of the arts.
Yeah, no, in the interpretations at the end, you talk about post-colonial realities and things like that. I was thinking about that.
These are themes that the authors are writing about. And if they are indigenous, so for example, about one very important article about the Sami claims to land and heritage, for example, here in the Nordic. I actually don't know if she's indigenous herself. So this is a review of research, not actual research on indigenous groups.
No, I get it, but I think it helps in the understanding, of what's coming out, what themes are coming out and stuff like that. But, it's just a question or a suggestion from a New Zealand perspective.
Yes, I'm sure that depending on who you are as a researcher, your interpretations are going to be colored by that. So here we have followed certain protocols for making literature reviews that are commonly used within the research community, especially in my field.
Sofia, there's a suggestion from Lara to maybe stop sharing your screen so we can see each other.
Yes, I will do that.
Thanks, Sandra. Tuli has a question.
Yes, thank you, Sofia. Thanks for a very nice presentation and a start to this nice seminar. So one of the things, I come from design, so my background is in industrial design originally, and then design research. And now when your framing of this actually brought to my mind the kind of difficulties we have. No, there's an echo. When we talk about creative practices in quite open terms, and now you framed to talk about arts and how does the design part come into the picture, especially maybe my lens is from the fact that I come from art and design school, and also what I see that in the art education, design is brought in actually quite a lot today. So do you have any comments on this framing?
Yes, I do. So when you want to map a research field, you have to make some kind of limitations. And the kinds of, for example, in the search strings, we design them after the scope of the AMASS project. Because one of the aims of this research was, of course, to inform the research done in the AMASS project. And this means, of course, that this review is by no way perfect or absolutely comprehensive of every kind of art form or design. But I think as a researcher, you have to make some kind of limitations to have a material that is possible to overlook and to review. So we try to use a understanding of art as broad as possible, but the visual arts and theater came in the forefront as our main search terms when it came to art, because we allowed sort of the scope of the AMASS project to influence the design of this particular study, and that's pretty common in this kinds of research. Which means that another kind of review would perhaps give other kinds of results.
Yes, indeed. And I think the interventions that you listed that we saw briefly already points into an interesting direction that we could look together with the Creatures project and yours. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Sorry for the typing. Lisette, go ahead.
Hi, Sofia. Thanks so much for your presentation. It's super interesting. So I was wondering about the how you frame it as like social impact, because there's some debate, about the risk of really instrumentalizing the arts, using it something to communicate something, whereas you can also think about it as a way to really ask different questions. And if you think about the ecological crisis, like who are we even as a human species, things like that. So how do you reflect on this, risk of instrumentalizing the arts?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Of course, again, the social impact of the arts needs to be theoretically informed. And in cultural policy, for example, this is a very heated debate, not a heated debate, but there's definitely a debate about the instrumentalization of the arts and when funding these kinds of projects. So some of the researchers are if you can identify two kind of positions. So some researchers in cultural policy are more like, but cultural policy will always be instrumental, right? If states or regions are going to fund the arts, it's because they want the arts to work in certain ways for society or for groups or for individuals. And the reason why cultural policy exists is because we as societies have these ideas about what art can do for us, right? Mm-hmm. So cultural policy will always be instrumental, whereas others are very critical towards this trend of funding the arts more and more because of these ideas of the social impact, and especially perhaps because the research evidence are quite shaky for the social impact of the arts. But there's definitely a very strong, I would say, understanding of the very positive impact that arts have on individuals and on societies, and that is why a lot of governments and regions and so on wants to fund the arts, because they recognize the positive power of the arts in people's lives. Mm-hmm. But of course, also from the side of the art, like the arts world, like this also since the 1990s has been the significant trend of socially engaged arts. It's called very many things. It's called participatory arts, it's called socially engaged arts, and there are other names. Claire Bishop has written a lot of interesting stuff about this, and this sort of trend in the art world is very much turning against the idea of the art for art's sake's idea that art should only be judged according to its aesthetical qualities. but seeks to interact in political and societal issues through arts and creative activities. So this is a very thorny issue, and it's not going to be resolved by researchers. I think it should be resolved by artists in dialogue, perhaps with researchers and policy, and yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess it also depends on how you would define social impact, right? But yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisette, and wonderful thoughts, Sofia, that really speak to the themes of today. Really great stuff. I'm going to use the advantage that we're a little bit ahead of time still, and give the floor to Professor Anne Light. Anne is Professor of Design and Creative Technology at the University of Sussex and Professor of Interaction Design, Social Change and Sustainability at Malmö University in Sweden. And Anne is also part of the Creatures Project, leading the work package on observation, and one of the imaginative minds behind the program. Anne, over to you. Is still muted, of course.
Error. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sofia, for getting us off to such a great start. I'm both exciting to see the commonalities, and I think I'm going to highlight some of the differences as well when I talk. I'm going to share my screen for a while, but I think I'm going to talk relatively briefly, because I would like to think that this is something that we're doing as a discussion as much as a series of presentations, because once we've both spoken a little about what we're talking about, then with any luck, it starts to be something that becomes more of a dialogue. The controls are in front of everything that I need to press. So let's just try. There we go. Okay, so Creatures, which is what we tend to call the project, actually stands for Creative Practices for Transformational Futures. My background is participatory design, but also collaborative future making. And that will probably become pertinent to how I present this, because in the end, there are so many both personal stories to be told through Creatures, but also the way that we all intersect has become increasingly complicated. And I think Joost gave us a nice introduction to the areas that we're trying to look at. And we, I think, doing very different kind of research, have been impacted much more by the fact that we started this in the middle of a pandemic. So some of the things that we anticipated doing, we're still doing. And so I will talk a bit more about that as we go through. Anyway, just to give you a sense of who the players here are, we have a consortium that is very much linked between academic researchers and creative practitioners as researchers. So we make a distinction in terms of where people are based, in the sense that we have slightly different responsibilities. But in terms of how we're doing our practice, we very much see ourselves as co-researchers. And it's a real fundamental that even if the practice of research manifests in different ways, we've got partners who are NGOs. We've got Sniffer here talking in a little while. We've got partners who are universities, like Joost, who's talking in a little while. But we've also got people like Superflux and Furtherfield, Helen and Kesnikova, who are partners in theorizing and in analyzing practice. And beyond that, we've got a whole lot of other people who've now contributed their practice as a way of understanding what we're doing. And so it's actually, this kind of maps the core, but we're now extending beyond that and building networks of people who are interested in how we understand creative practices as transformational. So I wanted to sort of set a context. I think one of the things that has inspired us, and is probably work that crosses over with what you've seen, Sofia, is the Playing for Time book by Lucy Neal and many other artist practitioners who talk about artists as the circuit breakers of tragedy, surprising people with alternative ways of seeing, jolting them awake from denial, and speeding up a public process of seeing and feeling the truth of climate change. They can make the moment of recognition less painful by opening possibilities for change and renewal. And while all our different practitioners see their mission in very different terms, and we've been working with them to understand that, I think there's something here that runs through what we're trying to do, as well as a recognition that we might be doing something that's a little bit out of the norm in terms of both sustainability research and arts research. So here we have the alien coming down and being met by people, but the alien is interested in the more than human world. And I think one of the transitions we're trying to reflect in the work that we've been doing is how there are many things that we can practically do as people to, you know, conserve water, reduce electricity use and things like that. But actually, if we're talking about complete reconceptualization, we're probably looking to the arts for that generative space between philosophy and practice, where we can actually start to think different and build an ecology of different thinking. So what we're particularly doing, I think, is trying to link the idea, which is somewhat fragmented, we feel, between the idea of healthy ecosystems and thriving communities, and that most of the people we're working with, if not all of them, are really embedded in the idea that you cannot separate all these different factors out, and that it's only by that kind of transformation in thought and that we'll get something significant in practice. So this was one of the graphics actually already from the bid, where we talked about how we understood the field that we were approaching. And then one of the things that we have defined transformation as a goal to understand how practitioners identify and define transformation within their own work and that of their peers, and how they currently evaluate their transformative achievements. We analyze these materials inductively to locate boundaries, definitions, and logics of change that are meaningful to practitioner communities. So we didn't come in with any overriding sense of what our transformation needed to be, or what we were even looking for, but worked very much iteratively out from the group who we'd gathered. And that makes us quite an interesting object, where in a sense we are our own ecology, developing our own practices. And I think that's becoming more and more apparent. But one of the things that I mentioned was the impact of the pandemic. And so what we originally thought we had done was sign up people who were deeply invested in making transformation as creative practitioners and who knew how they were going to do it. And what we discovered in the first year was that no one was going to be able to perform the way that they'd anticipated doing so. And so we were suddenly all in a transformative space together and moving through that to understand practices differently, and even how we could do that kind of research, because we'd initially assumed we would move amongst audiences as ethnographers. And in fact, we found ourselves very much in this setup as we are now, staring at small boxes on Zoom for the practices that people had managed to make sustainable. A lot of the materials that we thought we would be working with, we had experimental productions lined up in all kinds of places across Europe, which we were going to go and see as, you know, as action research. We found that they were just completely suspended or changed considerably. But what we felt, and what this is based on the idea that creative practice has already demonstrated transformational potential, and what we were actually trying to do was, perhaps this is where we cross very closely with your work, is kind of pull it together and actually understand if there's something that we can describe as a process that is running through all of this without overly defining what we actually mean. So we have a much broader understanding of creative practice than is perhaps normal, in that we understand it as constructive and imaginative labor, and therefore it can include things like participative citizen science and experimentation, as well as things like open data hackathons, games, writing, art and theatre, which crosses over very much with the work that you've been able to analyse, and using these kinds of skills to make something new, reinterpret some aspect of the world. And these are things that fed into what we have been doing. And but what we then did was narrow it much more to professional practice. So we've got within that design, commercial design companies. We've got extremely experimental art on one end, who are working with looking at how health could be reconfigured to be more supportive, how we could incorporate care into that. And even how we challenge those very conceptions. So our process has kind of three components to it. We have an observation, we have an observatory, we have creating, which is a laboratory, and we have evaluation. And the idea is that by doing these iteratively, we will be able to equip artists and policymakers. And we're producing an open creative practice framework, which is what OC and PF stands for here, which will enable both artists and policymakers to understand the creative evaluative kind of cycle if we're looking for these kind of transformation, and equip artists to be able to speak this language and do that work for themselves, and policymakers to see what comes out of it much more broadly than perhaps this kind of very purposeful instrumental use of the arts that you were referring to, where we're actually able to show that we don't always know what the outcome will be, but if we move into transformative spaces, we're actually requiring people to respond differently to their environment. And as we move towards something that needs to be perhaps more rapidly responding to climate and to other variables that are going to come out from that, that an agile population who are creating and performing is perhaps the bit that's not on this diagram, which would be the sort of this series of outcomes. And we're just at the point where we're beginning to gather some really interesting audience data, because we're able to go back into the field to do that. So we're structured, which is perhaps the least interesting bit, as I mentioned, with these sort of three core components. What we've discovered in practice is that these beautiful hexagons that we originally produced have really much less relevance than they would in many other kinds of projects, especially EU projects, which can be quite distinct in their function. Is just how enmeshed everything we're doing has become. And that one of the things that is so interesting is that really it's a study about how, if you're trying to change a system, you find yourself in a system where everything is as enmeshed as the system that it's trying to talk back to. And we're going to hear a lot more about the relationship with policy and with evaluation as we go through this morning. So I really just wanted to wrap up by giving you a flavor of one kind of project. So this one is very interesting in the sense that, first of all, this was supposed to be a project about deciding how the future of a park might play out if all kinds of species were able to come to the table and discuss it. But because it was supposed to be actively in a park, it was suspended, and typically amongst all our projects, it had to be rethought. So it became a very sophisticated online production, which I think was always part of the intention, but that became the focus of the energy rather than meetings in real life. And now it's in that interesting hybrid where it's still working out how all these different relationships are going to play together. But it has, for us, given us a very clear understanding of how the more than human is informing this project as a set of philosophies, and how that is being enacted by practitioners in really creative ways, such as games and different kinds of meeting where people are asked to play live action role play and so on. And in doing so, we're also able to work really directly with the people at further field, that they're using us as a sounding board, and we're using them as an investigation. So it's just to give a sense of how that could work. I'm going to jump this in the spirit of time and just point to the kind of the details, which are, you know, that we've got just over one more year to run. And if we wanted to sum it up, I would say that we were working with acts of imagination, materialization, and mobilization in our understanding of socially engaged arts, design, and creative practice. These are our players. May I hand over to you, and I will stop sharing, but I'm obviously very happy to answer any questions on aspects that I whizzed through. And if people from the team here feel that I've left out something in the overview, please do chip in.
Thanks so much, Anne. That was really, really wonderful to hear. A great combination of deep thoughts about creative practice and a clear picture of the Creatures project and what we're trying to do. I would love to hear some questions from people in the audience. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, but please raise your hand. I see Tuli, go ahead. You want to ask a question?
Thanks a lot, Anne, and thanks for running through the whole project in these pictures. And you mentioned some of the challenges that we faced in the project, including the pandemic and so forth. But something that Sofia brought up in her one of the last comments was this: that it's not enough that the researchers make the policies, but we need to include artists, researchers, and policymakers. And could you maybe reflect on that from the lens of the Creatures Project?
Well, I think one of the interesting things, and I was really impressed by how Sofia was able to delineate boundaries so clearly in the work that's going on in AMASS, and say that in some ways to say that we suffer from lack of boundaries, I think is really the wrong word. We enjoy our lack of boundaries, but it does have certain knock-on effects. So when we talk about policymakers and we're suddenly confronted with questions like, are we talking about funders? We're talking about, how do the influencers sit? We've got people who are absolutely aligned with this in their thinking. We've got people who are so opposed to what we're doing because they think it's messy and it doesn't produce targets, sort of like how much CO2 are we reducing through this work, and we're not prepared to commit to those kinds of reductive analyses. And we're working with our artists, some of whom have a very engaged way of working with their audience. I mean, the very term audience has become somewhat meaningless in here, because when you're working with people who are involved heavily in socially engaged art, the difference between an audience, a participant, and a co-creator can be very difficult to articulate or meaningless. So we have kind of almost waves of types of interaction where some people are more focused on how we're speaking outwards and how we're speaking to this growing group. So for instance, one of the initiatives that came out of it quite early was recognizing that we needed some way of people being able to discuss some of the complex issues that sit between art, with technology, with nature, culture, however we want to frame that. So we set up an active discussion group, which if you're not on it and you would like to be, please do get some details from us. We can ping that in the chat, on art, tech, nature, culture, where kind of issues at that apex are being discussed. And in that sense, we have, it might be somebody who's a passionate individual, or it might be part of a different arts group, or it might be policy or funder, actually all participating in the same discussions in those kinds of spaces in our seminars. So I think one of our challenges is how we classify, and another challenge is how we speak back to a world that perhaps classifies these things too harshly, and say that's not always useful when we're talking about making transformation. We're actually starting to think in terms of allies, kind of indifferent people, and people who actually just are never going to understand what we're talking about.
Thanks, Anne. I would love to see more questions. I don't see any raised hands yet, or anyone waving at me. Sofia, go ahead.
Thank you. And I would love if you could expand a little bit more about the impact of the pandemic on your project. I've just finished a small survey about this issue in the AMASS project, and one of the results from that is definitely how the increased dependence on like communication information technologies are sort of actually not helping when trying to address social marginalization. It's actually making things worse. Do you have any? Yeah.
Yes, I think we completely saw that. I mean, and also actually I've seen that across multiple projects actually. First of all, I want to point to my colleague Lara Houston, who's here, who did a lovely piece of work when we were just looking at the initial impacts of the pandemic, analysing and discussing with both our partners, but also all the people who were working in kind of locally engaged culture and art across, I don't know if you know, culture declares emergency, but we use that as a kind of way of understanding who our constituency might be for that, and looked at what the impact had been. And one of the overwhelming things was how much it had slowed everybody down and turned them towards kind of their own crises of funding. And so when we talk about marginalization, we have both people who were depending on some of the creativity in those spaces. I mean, I think not particularly so much in this project, but I know of a project which was a swap shop, which tried to go online to support its more vulnerable communities, and actually found that it couldn't take its vulnerable communities along. So you suddenly find that you actually, you know, your constituency is completely reduced by the pandemic rather than just enabled to go online. So that was one serious factor. But actually, if we think about the arts as a relatively precarious group, we found that they were intensely vulnerable, and that, you know, that some of them fell between different mechanisms for support, which meant that they were also really worried about their future. So we did an analysis of that at the first time and looked at, you know, how that caring and how the grieving and how the different components to the response played out, and that's published. So very pleased to share that with you. I think in terms of how it hit us directly, as I say, I think what it did do was in a way turn everybody who thought that they were confident in what they were doing into an experimenter much more than they'd anticipated. That included our research practices. So we suddenly were having to even renegotiate, well, what does consent mean when you're staring at several black boxes on the screen? Is it enough just to post it in the margins and say, yes, you know, we're happy for you to ask us questions about it? How do we access the people that we would have serendipitously rubbed up against if we'd been at the same performance? How do we understand whether they know each other in a way that would have been obvious if they'd all been sitting in a family group? You know, all sorts of questions that would make our work familiar to us were kind of thrown at us in a way. And in terms of what we saw in how people understood the link between the social and environmental crisis that perhaps many of our practitioners were responding to, that the social became very dominant, health issues became very dominant, but also the recognition that transformation is possible because the world had transformed so fast. So I think there was something very positive to be taken from it, but also an immediate focus on the now and the vulnerabilities of the now, rather than the vulnerabilities that become more general. And also perhaps a reflection that technology was both the great enabler, but also something that was dividing us. So again, how does that play when we understand it as a challenge in environmental terms?
Thanks a lot, Anne, and thanks for the questions, everyone. I see 2 more questions in the chat, but given that we are exactly on time still, I'm going to leave those questions in the chat in text. And Anne, if you would like to answer them in the text, what I would like to avoid is an entirely separate conversation that's so intense that nobody's paying attention to the speakers anymore. But I think some answers, questions and answers in the chat are welcome. So. Thanks, Johannes and Jenna, for the questions. Thanks so much, Anne, for your presentation. Super good to hear, and super valuable discussion coming out of it.
So maybe I'll wait for the break to answer the questions, but I certainly will answer them.
That's a very good idea. Thank you very much. So next up, I would like to invite Professor Andrea Kárpáti, who is professor and head of the Visual Culture Research Group at the Institute of Communication and Sociology at Corvinus University in Budapest. And Andrea will be talking about sustainability in fashion. Andrea, the floor is yours. And Andrea also comes from the AMASS project, I should clarify.
Yes, thank you very much. I will share my screen and tell you why I am very embarrassed after hearing the first two talks. Yeah. Share. I thought that this conference is not about us participants of the AMASS and Creatures project to discuss our projects, but to reflect on sustainability. Now I know it's not the case. However, I prepared a short talk on one of the issues that we are discussing with the adolescents that are involved in our group, in our different project groups for AMASS, disadvantaged kids, learning challenged, physically challenged, still very interested. It's one of the topics they wanted to discuss during their arts education interventions. So I will show you. Do you see my screen, by the way? My presentation? Yes, yes. Thank you. So I'm gonna show you first the Hungarian AMASS projects, about which I can take questions, I can share publications, and then I will do this little round on fashion and sustainability. And I am sorry I'm not discussing these projects right now because of my misunderstanding of the role of this conference. So our first project is the Roma Cultural Influencer Project. The Hungarian Roma in media are abused, misused, and not rightfully represented. That's why we are running a course now also, as I speak, for Roma girls and young women to become influencers. We furnish them with media skills and hope that they will launch their cultural channels. Actually, they have done so, many of them, and change the image among Hungarian youth and Roma youth using powerful social media channels. The second one is From Ghetto to Museum. Many of the Budapest museums are on the edge of the most disadvantaged areas of our capital city. Kids who pass the museum buildings every day never even think about going in there. Neither are their teachers, I must say. So we are trying to get them in, teach them about art through art, make them interact with art that may change their lives, change their mindsets. Our third project is even more down to earth. We are organizing knowledge building communities for teenagers with behavior problems and learning difficulties. They are learning mathematics, but not the normal way, the way they fail at school, but through visualizations, infographics, artworks. And these teenagers who are, when they fail in primary school, will never have a job and never sustain a normal living, are progressing in their studies. The fourth type of project that we are running is supporting teachers of socially disadvantaged, physically or cognitively challenged students. We have set up networks for these teachers and have regular in-service training courses for them, and also discussion rounds, workshops, share your ideas groups. We try to coach them or support them and learn from them, definitely. Learn from them a lot about why Hungarian social interventions so often fail. And now fashion. So I will be quick about it, because it's not really to the point. It's not what you wanted me to talk about. When you don't dress like everyone else, you don't need to think like everyone else. I love this quote because it shows that fashion is much more than dressing up. Something that you should despise because expensive, superfluous. It is one of the industries that causes the most damage for our environment. But fashion is actually a mindset, a sort of ideology, a language that creates itself in clothes that interpret reality, as Karl Lagerfeld says. And also elegance is an attitude. So it's much more than garments. It's a way of thinking. And this is the way we try to represent fashion in our projects. At university level, with our teachers, we speak about the semiotics of fashion that are actually social semiotics, being strong nonverbal signs, starting with Roland Barthes, who brought semiotics and fashion on the same platform. And we speak about context, situations, and cultures. the whole idea of bringing fashion in our arts-based intervention programs, actually all of them, was that one of the teachers from a ghetto school, when we invited her to come to the museum and just look at art and talk with us, she asked, what should I wear? Because I was hesitant to enter. I may not have the proper clothes. So we realized that this boundary between high culture and life, Hungarian everyday disadvantaged life, it involves dressing. It involves the signs and symbols that dresses convey. This chart by Cristina Morales in 2018 about fashion as a facet of strategic communication also strengthens the idea that one can use fashion strategically to influence people. The way we choose to interact with the world will be reflected in our fashion choices, and we shape culture through reflecting our identity, our subcultural identity towards society, sending signals, speaking the language of another style tribe, as Barthes calls them in fashion. Of course, lifestyle trends have a huge effect on fashion, and the networks of belonging have reached the 60-year-olds, of course, redefining the cult of youth. I find it very important in terms of talking about fashion, that the cult of youth that seemed to be so overwhelming around us, and again, back to the teacherhood, whom we are trying to support and who are trying to support us researchers of disadvantaged children and youth. So this mutual support, it is important that we cross the boundaries of youth, middle age, and older age, and redefine the cult of the different generations. Environmental consciousness comes to the question, enters the scene rather through the actresses that you can see now, and the slow movement, slow food life, and slow fashion was, I wouldn't say is, I say was a chance to recreate our ideas about fashion and make fashion sustainable. It started with Vivienne Westwood from the big houses, from haute couture houses, who brought subcultures like punk and trash into fashion, everyday clothing. Even an exhibition was organized, which is now entering at the Met. And then, of course, we could experience twists and turns, lifestyle turning into a fashion statement. And I find the Birkin bag story really tragic. Tragic in a way that something that starts with a healthy idea of changing women's lives for the better. In 1981, Jane Birkin, French actress, on a plane, sitting on a plane, just falls, her bag falls and everything, that's a big tote-like typical women's bag, and everything falls on the floor. And then she starts cursing, actually, and saying that, well, ladies' bags are good for nothing, and it's a symbol of our impossibility of logical existence. And then another passenger, a designer from AMASS, steps up and says that, yes, madam, we are going to design a bag for you. And that's how the Birkin bag comes to life. That is a fashion statement now from a utilitarian, a very nice purpose. It became a cult object and an investment, of course. And finally, here came the crocodile Birkin, which was absolutely against of anything Jane Birkin wanted to represent, and she demanded her name taken away from the crocodile Birkins. So fashion becomes a narrative That's also very important when we are working with the Roma. Their fashion, shame on me that I'm not showing it to you. Their fashion is so fascinating, so full of signs and symbols, and full of narratives. Now I'm showing you just a few hoodies and gym shoes, and that are, and of course that have been changed to convey a nice message. And of course, fashion diplomacy, another way of talking about fashion that may change the world, may change ideologies. And well, of course, here the Kennedys come to the picture. The Princess of Cambridge, like Vivienne Westwood, did an awful lot for consciousness about fashion when she wore her coat for a second and third and fourth time. And of course, there was a huge social media turnover about this event, saying that she re-wears a McQueen coat. Well, fantastic. So I should do that too, and try on a new habit. And green is the new black, signifying fashionable outfits. So a recycled retro vintage, as everybody knows, that's how this consciousness of fashion choices started with reusing something that's expensive, very expensive. So vintage and retro, they are differentiated by their age and by their price tags. But anyway, that was a very good point of departure towards sustainable fashion. The capsule wardrobe came at the same time. Lots of designers, even artist designers like Ying Gao, a mantra-based fashion designing artist, have come up with capsule versions, even with a dress like Gao did, that symbolizes change, because you could wear it differently 7 days a week. So don't have a lot, have little, possess only some items that are interchangeable. So sustainable fashion became not just a style, but also a value system and an attitude. And that's how the New Standard Institute came to life. That frustration and wanting to turn fear into action, fear about the doom of our world as we know it, into action to change our behavior, to change our usage of garments. And of course, lots of school projects, actually hundreds of thousands of school projects. Once we looked at them, how many of them address fast fashion, slow fashion, sustainability in fashion. And we realized that that's one of the most frequent arts-based interventions around. Of course, shopping, secondhand consumption, slow materials, recycled, the cut, minimalist, not to engage too many labor force. And value of origin should be your own country, which is a brand new concept, because here in little turbulent Hungary, clothes come from China, as many other places as well, for average citizens. Here,
Andrea, sorry to interrupt. We're a little bit over time. I just want to make sure that people can ask you some questions. Thank you.
Yes, two more slides. That's Vivienne Westwood's sustainable fashion, artisan fashion campaign. That's another take by another leading designer. And this I wanted to show you, because everybody thinks that sustainability in fashion won. No, it didn't. When you look at this film and the other haute couture houses, you realize that the post-pandemic playbook is that fashion returns to glamour, to glamour. People are sorry. They want to have fun. So fashion won't really contribute to the sustainability of the world, or not that much.
Thanks, Andrea.
Finish. Stop share.
Wonderful.
And
thanks so much.
Sorry for misinterpreting the topic.
That's okay.
And I
Thanks.
will be grateful for questions.
Yeah, that's a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for questions, and I would suggest that we break at the normal time, but that people can hang around for to ask a few more questions. If you agree with that, Andrea, while other people are breaking.
Yes. Anyway, I'm staying till the end. I'm very curious.
Great, fantastic. Thanks, Andrea. So, Namkyu, would you like to ask your question?
Johannes.
Namkyu, maybe Namkyu, we can leave your question for the text. Johannes, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Polyester is made of oil, so a lot of the clothing that people have is, I mean, they put oil on their very skin. So, I mean, we know from, putting other animals on the skin as being, sensitive for people, and they have changed those habits. Do you have any from the fashion world insights that putting oil close to our bodies or the skin is being a sensitive issue?
Well, not really. Preparing for this talk, I scanned through the sustainability papers and the against environmental damage papers. And there were some research reports actually on how dangerous contemporary fashion is, not singling out oil putting on your skin, but other products that are not good for you, simply chemical products in fabrics, unnatural, harmful. So yes, the idea is there, but about oil, I have not read.
Thanks, Johannes. Maybe we can, let me see, is there any hands? Maybe we can, Namkyu can't speak. Oh, there we go. Eva, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question that, I don't know, maybe it's frivolous, but I am attracted, I have been attracted for a long time. I observed the way Roma women dress here in Italy. In Italy, the dressing, the idea of fashion is very articulated, and it's something also debated. And also I've been observing that Roma women have different attitudes and styles in the way they dress up. Because, for example, I remember once I was in a residency in the north of Finland, and I was observing in the shops when I managed to meet them, the way Roma women from the area were dressing up, and their styles were different from the ones that are in Italy. So one day I went to these girls here in Italy, and I asked them, I love your skirts. Is there a place where I can purchase them? And they told me in Romania you can purchase them. And I think that in these skirts that were made of velvet, possibly artificial velvet, there were kind of big brands like Apple or other brands like that. They were kind of designed with little things. So I really had the idea that for there was a lot of freedom for them. They were also kind of doing things with their hair. So at a certain point I said, okay, I really love these skirts. I really love their style. I feel very attracted, but I'm not dressing like them, because I feel that there is an issue with the appropriation with that. And so I would like to know what you think about this appropriation issue that is big in fashion. Also in slow fashion is big, because Vivienne Westwood have been doing really interesting projects also in Africa. She worked with the Kibera, with the slums communities to produce items that then were sold with very high prices. So I feel that there is an issue in this, and I would like to know what you think about that.
Okay, thanks, Eva. We are into the break. I just wanted to say before you reply, Andrea, anyone who wants to take a break will come back officially at 11:30 for the next presentation. But go ahead, Andrea.
Do you want to become a Roma and look like a Roma or not? That is the question about dressing. So the girls we meet, they have to decide if they want to keep their identity or get further away from it. And what we encourage is keep your identity. That's why we present the fashion houses that actually work with Roma designers, and garments that they wear will become everyday wearable art. So the Roma is a diverse population with a very diverse symbolic system in their dresses. The Ola Roma are the poorest. We have some in our group. They came from absolutely impossible surroundings, and they are now at one of Hungary's leading universities. And they say, you can't press me wear a traditional Roma dress anymore, because I hate being looked down upon, patronized, even ridiculed. And we have the Romungro, the middle class Roma. Hungarian Ungro is in their name, Romungro. They embrace Roma symbolism, and they are ready now, after generations of upwards climbing the social ladder, to declare their identity. So the reason we discuss fashion with these girls, not just because they are interested, but because they have to digest, they have to process their identity as dressing. So thank you for bringing it up. Very important for the life of Romani.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Eva. I don't see any questions for now. So thanks again. Really wonderful. Some people have already started to take a break, but let's be back at 11:30, and we'll continue with the next part of the session. Thanks again, Andrea. Really wonderful. Hello, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break. It's great to see so many people still here with us, and we're looking forward to the next part of our morning. And we are, as you've noticed, alternating between creatures and AMASS perspectives, which has been really exciting. And I would now like to ask Irina Zamurieva to come and speak. Irina is an artist and cultural geographer, currently working as climate resilience coordinator at Sniffer, a sustainability organization in Scotland. And also with us today is Ruth Wolstenholme, who is managing director of Sniffer. And Ruth will also be here to help with some questions or discussions around Sniffer's work. Sniffer is a partner in the Creatures project as well. Irina, please go ahead, and I will.
Cool. Thank you so much, Joost. Can you see the slides on the screen?
Yep.
Yep. Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much. So yeah, my name is Irina. I will do the presentation, and Ruth is going to join us for the questions as well. So yeah, the position I speak from today is my role is Sniffer as the climate resilience coordinator. And as you said, yeah, Sniffer is a sustainability organization based in Edinburgh in Scotland. And what we're doing is creating spaces for organizations and places, people to come together to understand, anticipate, and flourish in the face of climate change. So what this actually means is really working a lot with people, shaping processes and shaping the processes of change. And in Creatures, we're involved mainly in the evaluation side of things. And in order to explain how we think about evaluation and valuing creative practice in that space, I will give you a few examples of what Sniffer thinks kind of about change making, how we got to the point of seeing ourselves as change makers, what's the relationship between change making and decision making, and where creative practices fit in that, and then say a little bit about how we carry this learning into Creatures. So this, just for context, it's important to explain where SNP has traveled with these perspectives a bit, and that it's not always been like a kind of SNP as a change maker, and that we are on a journey as an organization ourselves. And this is really important, I think, to understand, because this really shapes what we bring to creatures in terms of approaches and the contents. So over the past like 30 years, I guess, yes, SNP has started in the 1990s more in the role of a research provider for environmental regulators here in Scotland. So many of those people who started their careers actually in Scotland in the 1990s are now senior managers within the policy world. So these are exactly the people that some of them hold those beliefs and norms from that era, and that we are trying to influence, and the work that we're doing together with the grassroots level to bring about change. So starting with that more technical role in the 90s, SNP has moved in the early 2000s towards being more of a knowledge broker in the 2000s, and the 2015 onwards sort of is a transition to change making. And I personally joined SNP when I moved to Scotland in October 2018, so almost 3 years ago, joined SNP on its change making journey. So what this whole thing with change, sorry, it's quite a bit too fast. What the whole thing with change making means is that we're doing that in a couple of different ways. One of them is through capacity building of organizations and partnerships for action rather than for simply knowledge brokering or knowledge transferring. And another side of that is recognizing that individual behavior is not nearly enough to address the complexity of climate change and resilience, and that we need collective action and systems change. And a lot of our current work is very much about convening groups to imagine what a flourishing future looks like and imagining actual ways to get there. So this is where theories of change come in, and the emphasis on bringing the organizations and communities to work and think and imagine together. So this is very much about co-designing and opening the doors for participating in placemaking and future making. And I will give a more recent example of our work to illustrate what this actually means in practice. And this is about our work with Climate Ready Clyde, as I suppose an example of how this change in tech intentions were and can be co-created together with decision makers, and what creative practices have to do with it. So Climate Ready Clyde is a cross-sector initiative that is primarily public sector that SNP has been convening, that over the past 5 years or so has been working on, and actually a few months ago, launched a climate change adaptation strategy and action plan for the Glasgow City region. So this process has, as you can imagine, involved lots of visioning with lots of different groups. So this is very much not about kind of just few people gathering together and writing a strategy and then publishing it, as it sometimes happens, but it was a very elaborate and participatory process of co-creating change intentions together with the decision makers by a range of methods. So something we've produced to shape this theory of change, this strategy, sorry, was the theory of change. And it had 3 key domains. First one about people shaping their lives and places so that they're climate ready, so very much about capacities and skills and capabilities. The second being about the usage and distribution of resources, services, and assets, so very much about kind of the material side of things. And the third one that I will zoom in a little bit more is the conditions for change, or the idea that actors collectively create the right conditions in the city region to become climate ready. And this is exactly in this space of conditions for change that creative practices were acknowledged and thought of as really significant to be able to create those conditions for change. So they sit in this domain alongside boldness and innovation, and are recognized as the crucial kind of elements to bring about this change. The creative practices did not appear out of the blue, of course, in this theory of change that informed the strategy, but it was a result of us recognizing a need to bring in this different kind of thinking into those more like formal governance spaces. And it also was a result of a collaboration between ourselves and our partner organization, Creative Carbon Scotland, with whom we work a lot and who played a significant role in how this actually came about. So 2 key things that they helped us shape in this process was, first of all, directly involving creative practitioners into developing a strategy via a role of an embedded artist. And second is actually the shift in the thinking of what was achievable and thinkable and how. And as we looked back at some point onto this process of bringing in creative practice and reflecting, the 4 key things stood out on kind of what did actually bringing in the creative practitioners did. First was about changing the language, which was about thinking in different metaphors and using different concepts to think about the work that we're doing. The second was about changing the voices. So it's actually about who is being involved and opening up the spaces for participation to like much wider groups than kind of the usual suspects. And the other 2 were about changing the ways of working, the ways that we're relating to each other and shaping that process and changing our thinking. So how does this creative practice fit together with the world of policy and practice? Well, for Sniffer's kind of theory of change, the need for communities in all of their forums and public sector to come together is really, really key. And there is a role in attracting and empowering those who wouldn't otherwise engage for creative practice in the space, which I think resonates with some of what the Creatures experimental productions are doing. But also it's equally important to shift the culture that we see in the public sector towards encouraging kind of, being able to imagine those different futures and creative practices encouraging the socio-ecological imagination. And there's this third space for bringing those 2 together as equals, I suppose, but this is to say that they're equals is not to dismiss the power imbalances that are there, of course, but to practice the kind of more equal society that we're envisioning and trying to bring about. So there's a few things around understanding the pace of change here and that things don't happen obviously overnight or as quickly as we might like them to happen in the space, but where creative practices helped us to speed up that process in some ways and make the different kinds of futures desirable. So what this means for Creatures and how we're bringing this experience into Creatures is through a couple of different ways. First of all, the initial policy recommendation focus that we had as a project together with Joost and Anne and a few other involved, we have shifted that to thinking about much wider and collaborative process of decision makers' engagement. So much about building relationships with them rather than here you go, a policy recommendation that we've produced, but actually trying to figure out their more needs and concerns and underlying kind of issues that are there. And it's also very much about building a network, those that are in the decision-making positions and that are also those that have the desire for those different futures and are trying to understand better what would help them enact those different futures and where creative practice can support this process. So for doing that, we've been running deep dives or one-to-one interviews with some of the decision makers or those that are part of the policy landscape in its very broader sense in Scotland here. And while we have not done the analysis of what's coming out of those yet, I thought I would just share a couple of points that I hear as kind of recurring themes that are coming up from these conversations. So when we speak about transformations to these people, a recurring theme is the need to move away from growth when we talk about what transformations are in the first place. The second one being the need to pay attention to the inequalities when it comes to both production of and participation in culture. And the third thing is the struggle that these people face to articulate the value of something intangible, something that I think many presenters have been talking about today, this kind of intangible like outcome of cultural practices or activities that are embedded in this profit or outcome driven institutional environment and kind of the challenge of articulation that. And another strong thing that we see also coming out is the need and value for the artist to be more directly involved in decision making, but not necessarily having the means to articulate for why exactly, rather than feeling that that contributes a lot. And this is where the evaluation of value works come in that Joost will be talking about in a moment, where we are trying to also really get to the bottom of understanding what value, how do we value things fundamentally, creative practices in particular, and how that translates or travels into the policy spaces. So this kind of intermediary space of translating and thinking about what matters and how that travels into the decision-making space. It's really important here. And finally, what's next to us in the project, because we are right in the middle of it. We still have a year and a half to go. We're going to continue with these interviews and conversations, exploring individual perspectives, but what we're also hoping to run is something called soft space, where we'll be ideally, hopefully, bringing together those that we have interviewed and other people from the kind of decision-making policy worlds together with creative practitioners to explore regional governance, multi-species futures, and other emerging themes in creatures as this kind of experimental space. And finally, I think something that emerged throughout the creatures that we're trying also to nourish and bring to life is this creative community of practice, of change makers, those that already critically engage with creative practices and bring about change and finding ways to connect and support each other. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Irina. Wonderful presentation. It's such cool work, and also how it connects to creatures is really amazing. Thanks. Yeah, I would like to. We have a bit of time for some questions. I would like to hear anyone who's interested in asking Irina or Ruth some questions. Speak up, write them in the chat. Anything. Tuli, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Irina. This is a wonderful example that you're presenting, and I've heard about it before, and actually already started spreading the message in other discussions about your wonderful project there. And one of the things that this seminar is about is also how do we evaluate? What are the evaluation criteria? And I'm imagining that you could be looking at how this kind of example, how do you see new similar kinds of things appearing in maybe other parts of UK, Scotland, or somewhere else? Have you followed up on how your example is now being taken elsewhere?
I think in the ideal world, I would like to be able to do that and see how that traveled and where that was. But I think for us, it's very much about like also figuring out this in these informal conversations of hearing, aha, people have changed something as a result of this, but it's kind of we are here in a bit of a similar position as the whole Creatures project and the creative practitioners themselves, and kind of like really dealing with a massive time scale that often these practices bring about change in that, you know, it can be like decades or a long time basically until that change manifests itself. So the kind of the difficulty in actually pointing to, aha, this thing happened exactly because of us. That's really difficult, I think. But that example that I was giving with like changing language, the culture, that was one of the like, very practical ways that we tried to do this through the workshop of coming together and being like, okay, what actually changed, asking ourselves and kind of reflecting on that. I don't know, Ruth, if you have any better example of how that traveled in the UK, what we did?
Well, I think from this work, I think it's still at early stages, as Irina is saying, but I think what we're realizing is that as we interview people to talk about how they value this approach, we find that there's sort of a latent interest in this whole thing. So particularly those people who I would say that their focus might be on the healthy ecosystems or the thriving communities that Anne mentioned in her slide, and they aren't necessarily in their normal role, they're not thinking about creative practice, but I'm seeing what's coming from these interviews that actually once they're starting to explore this through the interviews, they really are enthusiastic, and I think there's more that can be built on this. And perhaps an unintended consequence of the project is that this could generate its own community of practice in Scotland, which could go beyond, because I think the joining up of those with interest, but coming at it from a different perspective and who haven't formally been including this in their roles, I think there's opportunity to build on it. So I think that's a great thing that's emerging from this. But also I think it is connecting us with other work that is in this space in the UK as well. And those connections are helpful for passing the messages around and growing this whole notion of transformational change through this way of thinking.
Thanks a lot, Ruth and Irina. Sandra, we have a few minutes left, 3 minutes, if you want to ask your question quickly and get a response.
Thank you, Irina. Kia ora from New Zealand. I work here for the Climate Change Commission, and it's an independent government agency. We're not government, but it's very interesting, our interactions with government, because as you mentioned, it's more like outcome oriented. You know, they have kind of deadlines and a very kind of a square focus. So I wonder, how did you convince them or, you know, get the buy-in to be part of this experiment?
Yeah, kia ora, Sandra. Thank you so much for your question. I think it's a really interesting one, because I think I did not feel so far that we needed to do that much of the convincing job, actually. And I think this is important because we as a team, when we came together and talked about, okay, what do we actually want to kind of, you know, create in the space of decision makers engagement? And the very important thing that emerged from that is actually we want to work with those and support those that are already trying to seed the change and grow it and support them in what they're doing. So it felt like much more identifying potential allies in those spaces and allowing people to bring themselves in their fuller like capacity when we speak to them, because I think so many of them are really very concerned about the world and about all the mess that we're in, and creating a situation where they can express that like kind of holistically and share those things that they might not be able to do that in that much like depth in their day-to-day work. And yeah, I think approaching that with the mindset of like creating like solidarities and connections has been something that has helped in, I think, creating that sense that people are willing to share things.
And with that, I guess with the hope of bringing that back for those policymakers, say, to their own groups or communities. So I just find it fascinating. It's really good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, we'll leave it at that. We're still nicely on time. Rafael, I would like you to start preparing. I will introduce you. So Rafael Vella is an associate professor in art education at the Faculty of Education, University of Malta. And Rafael will be talking about the implementation of a socially engaged project with a group of African migrants in Malta using photography, painting, screen printing, and fashion to develop technical skills in inclusion and social cultural life. And Rafael is our third speaker from the AMASS project. Take it away, Rafael, and very welcome. Good to have you. You're still muted.
Thank you so much, and I apologize for entering this seminar late, but as you can see behind me, I'm actually in a cultural center. We're setting up an exhibition right now as we speak, and it's opening tomorrow, so we're quite busy. And I apologize for any background noise, but this is a working environment, so this might be expected. Actually, the exhibition itself, which I'm curating over here, has a relationship with what I'm going to talk about, because it deals with migration. And it deals with migration from Malta to other places, which was very common, especially in the past. But what I'm going to speak about today is a project which, as you said yourself, forms part of the AMASS research project. And it deals with a different direction of migration, that is from the African continent to Malta. And this is something which we've experienced now for the last 17 years or so. And it has created a number of different reactions, including obviously racism and so on. And I'm going to share my screen at the stage so that you can see the presentation. Can you see it? Yes. I'll take that as yeah. Okay, so we'll start from this. Yeah, so this project is called Suitable Citizens, and I'll come to that, explaining the title itself. It is essentially a project with, as you said yourself, a group of participants who come from different countries in the African continent. Here you can see our kind of basic research questions. Can the arts mitigate societal challenges like discrimination? In a sense, this is a kind of key question which runs across all of AMASS. In this case, we are focusing specifically on a particular community, which is a community of participants who are coming from different countries in the, as I said before, in Africa. And we're looking at how can collaborative art workshops then bring people from different backgrounds together in a community building process. Essentially, in a nutshell, what we try to do in this project is to get artists, different kinds of artists, so artists who specialize in photography, screen printing, myself as well, I was involved, fashion, to work with these participants to kind of co-create different kind of artistic products and different kind of artistic artifacts amongst themselves. So that is sort of the background. And obviously what we also try to do on a much broader scale is to see whether this can actually help more politically in a more kind of social inclusion process or a sense of solidarity, perhaps. I said I was going to explain what the title refers to. It's actually taken from Malta's Citizenship Act. In other words, how do you acquire multi-citizenship by naturalization? And one of the criteria, what you're seeing on the slide is actually quoted. It's not my text. So one of the criteria for acquiring citizenship is that you would be considered to be a suitable citizen of Malta. Which is obviously a problematic term, because what does suitability mean? How can you define it? What is suitable for me might not be suitable for someone else. And this is something which, through our research, we discovered that it frustrates a number of persons who would like to acquire citizenship, but actually cannot, because this term is perhaps possibly deliberately ambiguous, because no one knows what to make of it. Now, we didn't actually try to define citizen, or suitability in this project, but we tried perhaps indirectly to look at what it means to work together, what it means to work as a team, to include people from different contexts in culture, which is an issue in local cultural policy as well, and perhaps indirectly then define suitability in that way by actually creating projects together. As you're seeing in this slide, they were selected through, we had an NGO on board, which is it was called JRS, Jesuit Refugee Service, and we actually had interviews with the participants. They were explained, what to expect. Initially, we were planning to have 30 hours of workshops. We ended up having 50 because we realized that, well, perhaps 30 weren't enough, perhaps 50 weren't enough, because it's never enough. And also because after 30 hours, the participants really wanted more. So we decided, yes, okay, let's do it. And we extended it and added more also technical skills and also more products which we were creating together. We also had a number of different data collection tools, and here you're just getting an outline. So as we were doing this workshop, we were obviously collecting data. So the workshop had, in a sense, two different aspects to it. There was an artistic, creative aspect to it. At the same time, there was a more research-oriented aspect, and we wanted to somehow bring them together. So we had, for example, pre- and post-test assessment surveys where we collected certain data about them, for example, about well-being before and then afterwards, about their perceptions about socially engaged art before and then after the workshop. We had focus groups, we had interviews. The artists themselves who were involved, including myself, kept journals throughout. We also had photo voice, which is basically getting the participants to take photos and then to also explain the reasons why they took certain types of photos. Okay, moving on. This is basically the pedagogical structure of the workshop in a nutshell. So we started off with basic skills in photography, things like composition, light, pattern, and so on. We gave them certain tasks to do on site and also at home. So, thinking in terms of people, places, and things, because we felt that these are kind of very generic themes that could easily be interpreted differently. We also eventually did, I'm not going to show you in this presentation because there's no time, but we also did an image analysis of this and what were their approaches to these three generic terms. From photography, we moved to screen printing, and so we basically used the photos they had produced as the basis for screen prints, which they did on paper, on tote bags, on fabric, which was used for face masks, and also on chiffon, which we used for scarves. They also had a very basic, sessions on stitching techniques with a fashion designer, and that actually had brought us to the end of the 30-hour period, which I mentioned before. After which, then we decided to increase by having additional sessions on stenciling, and this basically refers to the last 20 hours, which we added eventually. And in the stenciling, we went, to stenciling on paper and then again onto fabric, and we also created a big kind of collective team fabric, which I'll be showing you details of in photographs in the following slides. And I think also throughout this whole workshop, they also developed other skills which were perhaps more critical skills, which I think are extremely important, especially since the seminar seems to be talking not only about creativity, but also how creativity can transform people's lives. They developed critical skills, for example, even public speaking skills. Something which I haven't mentioned yet is we actually documented this whole workshop by training an Eritrean migrant who has been living here for a number of years in filmmaking and film editing. And so the actual process of documenting the workshop was also a pedagogical process. And as this migrant was interviewing his friends, the other participants, they were developing public speaking skills. So we were helping them also in that respect. These are just a few photos to give you an idea of what it looked like. So starting top left, you have photography. Moving on to the middle, you have screen printing, then fashion design, top right, and stitching and sewing. And then bottom left, we also had a little catwalk outside in the university. And then in the middle and at the end, bottom right as well, this is the stenciling kind of group project which we did together, this large fabric which was actually made of a number of smaller pieces which they had stenciled. And these are additional photos where you can see, for example, on the left, you can see the tote bag produced by this is one of the participants. Below her, you can see the face masks with their designs. The scarves are in the middle. As you can see, the designs were actually a mixture of photographic designs, kind of semi-abstract, sometimes also based on their own drawings. And on the right-hand side, you can see the stencils, which were a mixture of images and also text, which they created themselves. Moving on to just a little outline of some of the results we had without going into excessive detail. These were some of the main themes that emerged from the artists' journals. We divided the main ideas into three themes. One was related to the participation of the participants themselves, which was actually extremely positive. No dropouts, then constant interest and enthusiasm for the course, and asking questions all the time, helping each other out, which is quite interesting to see. Then we also looked at these other two aspects in the journals, which were kind of artistic aspects, or what I'm calling here technical aspects, and then non-artistic aspects, which I think were extremely important in a project of this kind. And by non-artistic aspects, I'm thinking here of things like, political or social issues that form an important part of their lives. And we found that, for example, most of the participants were more explicitly interested in being in the workshop to learn new skills. I want to make this help my life in some way. So learning new skills because they felt that this could possibly give them better possibilities, for example, of job, employment and so on. But I think that, on the right-hand side, then with the non-artistic aspect, I think that even though perhaps in the beginning, when the participants were still warming up to each other, they weren't sure whether they should start dealing, publicly with political issues and so on. When they did warm up to each other, they opened up much more. And they did realize that art can also be used to make a statement, and a statement of a more political nature. And I think this was an important aspect of the workshop as well. These are some of the main themes that emerged from our qualitative data analysis. And this was based on focus groups, on photo voice, as I said before, on interviews we had. So here we're dividing them into a number of different themes. Familiarity with Maltese culture and life was considered to be quite important by the participants. They accepted that perhaps they don't know enough, and they wanted to use the photography, for example, to take photographs of particular sites and then discuss them during the workshop, so that the photography kind of also indirectly helps them not only to learn photographic skills, but to learn more about Maltese cultural life, for example. We were talking also about friends they made in Malta, and this was really kind of quite a relatively narrow range. So kind of predictable to a certain extent that the people they spoke to most were kind of social workers, members of the Jesuit Refugee Service, other obviously community members. We spoke to them about their background skills, whether their prior knowledge is valued at all. And initially they said, yes, it's valued, but there are still certain difficulties in moving up the social ladder. And they wanted this course to help them develop a CV. So this is actually something else we went into. Difficulties or challenges related to integration, we went into that as well. So they mentioned language, culture, rituals. Essentially, one of the things they kept talking about was that it was kind of reciprocally difficult for them to understand people in Malta and for people in Malta to understand them. And a constant reference point was the detention policy in Malta, which is actually quite tough. And they were constantly referring to it as essentially a prison. And the role of the arts, in other words, the role of a project like Suitable Citizens, what they believed about it. They were skeptical, but as the project developed, and we saw this coming out as well in quantitative data, they started to believe that it's more possible to use the arts to perhaps make a change, especially a change in people's outlooks. So this is something which came out. They hoped that even the documentation that I mentioned before could be used to change people's perceptions about what it means to be different or other. This is a slide which shows how we could integrate the qualitative and quantitative data. As I just said, in fact, we realized that participants' views of the project and socially engaged art in general improved from beginning to end of the project. And this is also clear not only in the data itself, but I think more importantly, even in the results and in the documentation, which actually shows very clearly that they felt more at ease and more at home in the project. I think also a clear indication is the fact that we started getting emails from friends of theirs who wanted to join similar workshops, which we hope to be able to offer in the coming months. Also, the learning of new skills was crucial for participants. We felt that, once they started to become more familiar with certain skills, obviously, as those of us who teach the arts know, once you become more confident with the skills, then you can become more creative. And they felt this quite clearly. And also that they could, as I said, use the arts and their creativity to make a statement, perhaps a political statement. Nothing too radical, I have to say. So we did try to push, but only to a certain extent, so that we wouldn't put them in situations that perhaps they would find themselves uncomfortable in.
Raphael, just to say that we are 5 minutes over time. So if you like
this is the last slide. This is actually the last slide. So I'm just saying here, what we're planning for the future is exhibitions. We just had an exhibition of part of the results in a festival in Istanbul. It's still open now, and we hope to show this again later in Malta. And I can stop here, and if anyone would like to ask any questions, please do so.
Thanks, Raphael, and apologies to you and all speakers for interrupting sometimes, but I gotta keep time. Thanks, really wonderful presentation. And thanks for stopping the screen share. I would love to hear some questions. We have a few minutes left for questions for Raphael, and let's see who would like to ask more. Just looking at all the screens, there's quite a few people here. Tuli, go ahead.
Sorry for being always the first one, but really fantastic, interesting presentation, interesting project. One of the things that we've noticed in creatures is that while, of course, the creative practice audience in a way is wider, but when we are also ourselves involved in some of these activities, there's a change within ourselves. And I wonder if you've tried to track also those kind of reflections within your research team or the ones in the core team organizing those workshops, and whether that leads into some sort of transformations from the perspective of sustainability.
I agree completely with what, in fact, this is also why I kept the journal myself. And it is something which I have to say, you know, experiencing a workshop like this does transform you personally as well. At a very basic level, it's, you know, you open yourself to new experiences, to new acquaintances, and you make new friends, and that's bound to, you know, that's bound to make a difference. There's also a basic, I think, question which we need to ask ourselves, which is about, you know, a question, I think it's a question which one can ask about all kinds of participatory projects. To what extent do you as the researcher or you as the artist want to kind of leave your impact on the project, especially on the creative output? I think that once you're part of the project, it's impossible to disappear completely. I really believe this is impossible. And I noticed even in the documentation of the project, the one I just mentioned, you know, before with this Eritrean migrant, his own voice is there all the time. Once you're in a project, you're bound to leave an impact on it. And it's bound to leave an impact on you as well. So the relationship is to some extent reciprocal. I found that, you know, by reflecting about it very, very consciously and explicitly, by keeping a journal, kind of going back and forth from one meeting to the next, I found that helped me to kind of evaluate this process and to also make certain, you know, like fine tuning from one session to the next. But definitely, yes, it does leave an impact on you as a researcher and on the methods you use to conduct research. We did have, for example, certain data collection tools, which we did fine tune as we went along, because we realized that certain types of questions just wouldn't be understood the way we hoped they would. And that's a learning curve. You know, it's part of a learning process, which you know, you have to actually meet the persons and spend some time with them before you are sure 100% like what data collection strategies would be most appropriate in that kind of scenario. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Sully. Thanks, Rafael. We have time for maybe one very quick question. If not, we'll keep moving. And of course, feel free to ask questions in the chat. The next presentation will be mine, so I'll be less worried about you being distracted while I'm speaking. I won't feel too offended. So I will pick things up from here, and I'm just going to.
Joost, do you want me to introduce you, or have you been introduced?
I have not been introduced. Go ahead. That would be very nice.
So Joost Vervoort is Associate Professor of Foresight and Anticipatory Governance at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development, Utrecht University in the Netherlands. His research focuses on how imagined futures are used to impact present-day action. And in the Creatures project, he focuses on how creative practices can be evaluated in terms of their contributions to sustainability transformations. So go ahead, Joost.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Julie. That's really nice to hear. Yeah, so we've already heard a lot about creatures, and I'm just going to talk a little bit more about our evaluation practices today. So. And just adding a little bit on the transformation perspective, right? Because we've heard a lot of different perspectives on the link between sort of creative practices and transformation, but there's so much to uncover. What do we study? What do we look at when we think about how to navigate change, how to go through these sort of like transformative changes in society? It is not very self-evident, and I think that the richness of everything that we're talking about today really shows that there's so much to discover here. So one of the ways that maybe not all of you are familiar with to look at where change happens in systems is this very nice model developed by Donella Meadows, a great systems thinker and communicator, where it's possible to consider systems change at all kinds of levels, from sort of like the buffers and the sort of the numbers, let's say, what is in the system, what resources are available, what are the flows, all the way to the rules of the system, the structure of the system, the goals of the system, and mindsets and paradigms. So it's possible to really think about leveraging change at all these different levels and how they interact with each other. And then, here at the bottom, you see the power to see paradigms as such. Also, this also relates to thinking about myths, societal, cultural myths and metaphors, etc. I would like to ask one of my colleagues to just please mute people if they're unmuted, because I can't see the system anymore. I hear some unmuted sounds. That would be very good. Thank you. Yeah. So how do we look at this in creatures? So one of the very valuable things that we're doing in creatures is looking at this at different sort of scopes or different levels. So we've already heard a lot about how sort of experimental productions, how creative, that's the way that we describe sort of the creative practices that we're engaging with, how they relate to publics. And this is a lot of where the AMASS work is in terms of that connection. But what we are very interested in creatures, as we've also heard from Anne and Irina, is the perspective on evaluation from the perspective of the creative practitioners, and how do they see the dimensions of their own work. Now, how we understand this is that creative practices are shaped by larger societal forces and values and dynamics. And these sort of larger societal dynamics, and this is the transformation that we're interested in, these sort of bigger sustainability transformations, they shape also the regimes of value, these sort of dominant ways in which art is being valued, understood, evaluated, funded, etc. And not just sort of in art spaces, but also in spaces of sustainability and other sectors that are interested in mobilizing creative practices for their own purposes. And as Sofia mentioned, there's a lot of instrumental sort of aspects to this, which is sort of unavoidable. But of course, these regimes of value, they enable and constrict what can actually happen within creative practices. And if these are changed and opened up, this can also allow creative practices to be recognized, supported, etc. more, and contribute to larger scale regime shifts as well. So this is sort of how we think about systems change in this sort of nested mode of being interested in engaging with creative practices and how they engage with publics, but also being interested in seeing opportunities for shifting these regimes of how creative practices are valued in order to contribute to larger transformation. And this, luckily, is very much what we see, at least among some governing actors, some people who are funders and supporters and policymakers, how they think about this work as well. We've already heard a little bit about this before, but if you look at, for instance, the Carasso Foundation's model, they really talk about changing values and shifting regimes towards new systems, and sort of the role of cultural work involved in this sort of like shifts of values towards new models of the world, new ways of engaging with the world. So it's very exciting that we are very much lining up with people at different levels. There is so much to uncover in terms of how we conceptualize where transformation happens, and I mentioned these different leverage points that are there. We have simplified them here a little bit and sort of clustered them a little bit, but there's all these different leverage points that exist in systems at different levels, and all these different places in the system where interventions can happen, or where changes can happen. And what we see here, and I won't go too much into this figure, but it's just to give you a taste of what we're looking at. This is the sort of lighter orange here are the places where we feel creative practices have a little bit less of a direct influence. But when you go to a darker orange into this sort of bright dark orange, some of these things are very closely connected to what can be done with creative practices, building trust, challenging established rules, thinking about power structures, spaces for co-creation, and as you can see, the deeper we go into the system or into the intervention levels or the leverage point levels, the more creative practices can arguably do. But it also becomes harder to understand what exactly is going on. And so when you look at how the power of creative practice is typically conceptualized in the transformations sort of like research space, there are very specific lenses on this that are very valuable. But for instance, there's a lot of focus on imagination. There's a wonderful special issue in Elementa, which is about how imagination and transformation are connected, and they offer these sort of like models of agency, causation, and individual collective dynamics. But that's focusing on imagination, and who's to say that in fact, you know, we can't look at much more than just imagination. There's a lot of assumptions about that being a sort of a mechanic for or a mechanism for change, right? So Anne has already mentioned the further field Treaty of Finsbury Park project, and I just wanted to show you a little bit of how we engage with evaluation thinking in creatures around a project such as that to sort of like demonstrate the richness of what comes out of this kind of work. So we've already heard that the Treaty of Finsbury Park is a project, it's a sort of multi-species engagement where collective action is being taken by going with live role-playing setups to imagine a sort of multi-species communication and setting up of this treaty around multi-species action around Finsbury Park. And so there's an incredible richness to how our colleagues in further field think of what they're doing with the world in this. And so we have we've developed a sort of meta level evaluation method to help people understand how they think about change, that goes from a change narrative to then mapping out lots of different dimensions of what they consider valuable about their work, and then thinking about matches and mismatches with their evaluation environments, and thinking then about designing measurement and analysis from that. And so what comes out of this is that if you look at how Furtherfield themselves understand their work, it is at these different levels and all these different dimensions. They talk about wanting to understand how their works contributes to playing with intersubjectivity and world making, how it contributes to collectively created more than human peer-to-peer knowledge systems, which is quite concrete, right, in a way, translocal cooperation, more than human governance, care, embodiment as a way of knowing, empowerment, working with transgression and moral hazard, more than human technology, and project economics as prefigurative practice. And you can investigate all of these things in great detail, right? And they require different methods, they require different lenses and different types of work. So there is an incredible richness if we start from the perspective of the creative practitioners, which is often only partly captured by the existing literature, because it starts from other places. It starts from learning, or it starts from transformation, and there's just such value to starting from this richness and then thinking about how to research that. So before we go on, I've already mentioned, or Irina has already mentioned this sort of notion of soft spaces, this idea of working with the policymakers and the governing actors around creative practices in a new form, in sort of like semi-official spaces where there's a bit more creativity and freedom to work on important policy and governance questions, and in fact making sort of policy conversations a creative practice itself. And we are focusing on several different themes. Irina has already talked about the national and local context, but at the sort of larger European and global level, we're engaging with this topic of more than human multi-species as a sort of thematic focus. And then the other focus is on playful encounters, because a lot of work in creatures focuses on games and play, and as a sort of mechanism for change, or a way to engage with change. And there are, of course, communities of policymakers, governing actors, networks, researchers connected to all of these different teams. So if we go back to learning from these two projects, you can see that in creatures we're very much starting from this sort of practitioner perspective and the sort of governing and context actors perspective, and then building our engagements with publics from insights that we get there. And of course, what AMASS has been doing is very much focused on the sort of public engagement side, which I think is very fruitful to connect. And we'll have another session next week, just with the projects to work out these complementarities. Yeah, so that's me. I'll hand over to myself and see if there are any questions from the presentation. Thank you. Any questions for Joost?
Yes, I could
Julie.
start. Yeah. In the very early stages of Creatures project, we had this conversation about gate openers and gatekeepers. And I think in your soft spaces or the soft spaces activities, that's a little bit about, you know, these kind of things like finding the gatekeepers or the gate openers. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would say that it connects a bit to what I think Anne has already been saying as well, which is that these sort of gatekeepers and gate openers, we have definitely lots of people out there who are very much in this sort of movement that all of us, I think, are talking about, right? They are our allies. They, you know, when you talk to them, it's a lot of yes, exactly kind of feeling to it, right? But then there are, of course, lots of people out there who, for whom this is all very new. And I believe we have to engage with both types. But I think starting with the allies is the best way to start, to build the momentum, to build the movement, and to build strong cases of where we are taking this work. And that's where the sort of communities of practice and these soft spaces can be very valuable, because if people engage with their peers, you put people from the Carasso Foundations, for instance, together with people who might be interested in this sort of like new paradigm of working on evaluation and thinking about transformation and creative practice, but simply don't have enough experience with it, that can be very valuable. Some of the policy interviews that we've done, we certainly heard people say that in their perspective, their peers just don't have a theory of change at all around, right? They just don't know how to think about how creative practice relates to transformation, and they would like to learn. I think that sort of peer work will be really valuable there. It's much better for peers to talk to each other with our facilitation about best practices around this stuff in the policy space than for us to tell them what to do. Thanks, Tully. I hope that was that answered your question.
Yes, and there's Elise has a question. I wonder if you want to say that out loud.
Yeah, go ahead, Elise. I don't know if you are able to speak, but I can just read your question. So Elise is saying, do you find it difficult to find? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I'm in the street, so I cannot really talk. Yeah, do you find it difficult to find interlocutors? You describe for peers, but for institution or more like business, engaging in the same values and the same objectives than you?
I think that the answer is no and yes. I think that there are many people out there who are operating in this space. I think especially in sort of like or larger organizations, but also sort of bottom-up organizations. Like there are lots of people who are very much thinking like this, right? I showed that Carasso Foundation sort of a transition model, right, as an example. But there are many more people out there, I think, for whom this is all very new. So the answer is at once yes and no. And again, I think it's similar to my answer to Tully. I think that developing peer groups of exchange will be well, we're starting to do that already, but that would be extremely powerful for opening up that sort of like possibility space in terms of changing those regimes of value. And I also think that we are also in the middle of conceptualizing what that means, right? Thinking with others here in the Creatures project about what it means to do regimes of value. Lara, it would be helpful to explain the facility of the tool to identify evaluation matches and mismatches. Yeah, that's a really good point. So what has been very interesting as a sort of development in this method of working with our creative practitioner colleagues is to, once they've sort of described in great detail what are all the different elements and different dimensions of the work that they value and how they see that they are contributing to the world, to then ask them, so how are others, those that you are dependent on, those who fund your work, those who evaluate your work, the policymakers, etc., understand, interpret, frame, and evaluate your work? And this has been very valuable because there are, of course, mismatches between these two things. And there are instances where translation can be hard, and instances where translation can be easier than people thought. That some of the ways that things are framed by policymakers, funding councils, etc., are actually connected to the ways that the creative practitioners think about it themselves. But there just needs to be this sort of like conscious translation. And I think shared sense making between those groups would be very nice. Lara, do you want to ask anything more about that?
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting question about, I mean, we know that decision makers prefer causal evaluation, and that's actually because they're in a situation where they have kind of responsibility for public funds. So they're in this kind of regime of value that's actually very serious, because that is a collective responsibility that they hold. And then on the other side, Creatures is really trying to think about how to evaluate whether a creative practice kind of produces this transformative space towards sustainability. And so rather than, we need to recognize that evaluation is kind of a managerial practice that's deeply situated. So on the one hand, you know, it can't necessarily be the same thing for different groups, or it's done for different ends. And it's really important to, first of all, be clear about that, what the evaluation tool is evaluating towards and why. And then on the other hand, to try and like productively encounter each other between policymakers and creatives. So, okay, we might start to evaluate in a kind of spectrum of ways. So many of the creative practitioners, they talk about evaluating their work for themselves, and then they talk about evaluation as like this horrible thing that they have to do for funders. So the question is kind of how to open up that field and to create spaces where forms of evaluation can be sort of held together. And also then that kind of creates a space where people can encounter, for example, different ideas of what sustainability might mean. So for some funders, that's about kind of showing that you've reduced your carbon outgoing, showing that you're recycling your paper. And then for other funders like Harasso that Joost has shown, that's really about this massive kind of system change. So I think in Creatures, I think we understand we're not going to step in and answer this question, but really how can we platform, how can we create tools that allow people to be really clear about what they're doing and why and for what ends, and to create spaces where they can really productively encounter each other.
Yeah, totally. And I think that an ideal situation would be, right, and this is something that we hope to cultivate, to have those conversations about those mismatches with all of the people involved in the mismatch, do some shared sense making and translation, and also say like, okay, we understand how you're seeing your own work. We have to frame it like this, unfortunately, because of all this institutional context, but at least to understand that things can be framed very differently and to find some shared sense making that can be incredibly powerful, it seems. And just that dimensionalization of, you know, just a richness of how creative practices, creative practitioners consider their own work, making that visible to policymakers as well, to say, oh, we are evaluating this work in very specific ways, and we're just missing all of these other aspects that are just wonderful, and that we can actually translate to some of the things that those around us care about that fit into our systems, and some of them don't, right? I mean, it's but at least to sort of make that conversation more multidimensional is, I think, very exciting about all of this work. So yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, there's much more to come. So we are more or less on time. Thanks everyone for being very collaborative in that regard. So we have half an hour left for a general discussion, and Tuli, I see you're on the board for guiding that discussion, but I'm also happy to help as well, and other people as well. I think we can all do that together. So go ahead, Tuli.
Good teamwork here. So I would like all the presenters to be actively now involved and think back a little bit on what we've heard today. And to me, it seems well, it's obvious and clear that all of us are believers in a way, that we have this trust that the creative practices have this incredible transformational potential in fostering social and ecological sustainability. And what we want to do in both of the projects is to follow and experiment and find ways to translate that into something that others can also follow up, maybe copy, maybe believe in. And certainly one of the things that I see important to pinpoint in whatever we do with arts, our creative practices, is this urgent need that we have in the world on sustainability and the global warming, and you name kind of big problems. Maybe I would like you to quickly just say what's in the top of your mind based on the discussion today in terms of thinking about the theme of this seminar, the creative resourcefulness for sustainable future. So how does this sustainable future come to play today? Sofia, do you want to start? Oh, yours this quickly. So you can have a little reflective moment, Sofia, and yours can start.
I am still warm, and I just wanted to use the opportunity of my warm brain for this. So one thing to sort of maybe just offer is that, and something that we talked about a lot, I've talked about a lot in Creatures, is this, and especially coming from you, Lara, that this idea of creative practice is simply handing over a package of value to transformation, and sort of transformation processes is a very limited way of looking at it. And that, in fact, turning it around, considering all of this sort of work towards transformation and all of this societal activity, including evaluation as creative practice, is quite valuable, right? That creative practice can sort of encompass a lot more activity than how we normally cordon it off. That's just my reflection.
Do you want to continue, Sofia, from there?
Yes, thank you. So one thing I've been thinking a lot about in relation to evaluation and assessment of success of these kinds of projects is who gets to decide when we've succeeded. Like who gets to formulate the goals of what we're supposed to do. And I think one thing that I think that everyone involved in these kinds of problems really should be careful about is to define, for example, marginalization as a lack of art, a lack of access to artistic practices and so on. Because the risk is that we immediately define ourselves as the salvation to that problem. And perhaps we should see a further lack of art because of what? And also, of course, in relation to who's supposed to formulate the problem that we need to solve, right? What should it be the part of artistic quality, for example, in these kinds of projects, and who's that important for? And really, I would like to have discussions on who defines the problem and who becomes the natural solution to that problem, and what becomes the natural. Because these are, I mean, so marginalization, environmental, climate change, these are huge problems. So how do we define success? And who gets to define success now when we assess and evaluate our projects?
Excellent question, Sofia. I don't think we all have answers to those, because these projects are still in the middle, but Irina, do you have an answer, or do you want to have your own questions?
Yeah, I'm afraid I would just give you more questions, but I think something that this year makes me think of here too is this very much linked to what Sofia was talking about, of sort of who is seen as needing to change, right? And the sort of being busy in the work of like change making is sort of very easy to run with a certain version of, these are the people, the groups that need to change. And how do we do that without like sort of ignoring the power imbalances? Because I'm very interested in like, the power and the way that historically these power relations have been shaped in the way that like colonialism and patriarchy have shaped this kind of, the world that we live in many ways. And how through the kind of aspiring to bring about change, we kind of unlearn what are the harmful dynamics and how do we collectively embark on that process of unlearning. And once we unlearn those things, how do we collectively imagine those things in ways that do not reproduce harm and violence? So this is where I'm thinking. So this is, as I said, a question to your question.
Thanks, Irina. Anne, would you like to continue from there?
Well, I mean, I was just thinking about my own kind of answers to some of these questions, and I noticed for anyone who hasn't looked at Daniel's comments and questions in the excuse me, in the chat, we're very much posing some of these questions about in kind of power and whether things can be top down and who participates and what does it mean to be a place and what does that mean for people coming into it and leaving it and what is a group in a sense. And a lot of those kinds of questions are obviously dealt with through eventuality, and we can't necessarily prescribe a lot of that stuff. But one thought that I wanted to bring in is whether we're even talking about solutions, because I understand that evaluation is much about solutions. But a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the practices that we're supporting are actually deliberate destabilizations of unhelpful norms. So there's actually a kind of double negative going on here. We identify something that isn't working, and then we set out about not solving it, but actually getting people to ask the question and think about what it is meaning, what it is costing, how it plays out. And through becoming more aware of some of these things, through practices of noticing and practices of engaging with others in shared concern, then already our quality of life has changed and our orientation to some of these things have changed. So I don't know that we're trying to come in with top-down solutions at all, but we're trying to make those issues of how we understand our world and how we have to travel politically together to be able to enact any kind of difference more legible for people. And that comes in a lot of different ways in a lot of different kinds of groups and publics and formations. And I think one of the reasons that I wouldn't mind particularly if Creatures comes out with very diverse outputs is that in the end, what we're seeking is more of this kind of questioning and more of this kind of rejection of unthinking norms. Because as soon as you start to say, why am I doing this? Everything changes already. So I'm putting it out there as a provocation, I think, as much as anything else, but that's in the spirit of Creatures.
Thank you. Andrea, are you there? Would you like to also reflect?
Yes, I'm here and I will start my video. My main message that I'm taking, do you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. Okay. The message I'm taking away from here is that there is wide variety of arts-based interventions about social issues, and they are being evaluated, reflected upon, assessed. And this is a very, very good development, because as you could hear from Sophie Lindström, the previous project, that was the major issue with the previous project, that they were not reflected upon, were not assessed, and perhaps that's why they were not sustainable. So I do hope that these projects will be sustainable. I also appreciate the detailed description of your methods and procedures, because another bad characteristic of arts-based interventions is that they are not repeatable, that only an artist with a glittering eyes and fantastic charismatic personality can do them, and nobody else. But here I took notes all the time from the beginning of this seminar, because you gave us inspiration and ideas that we can certainly adopt to our own situations and replicate in one way or the other. So this is also a good development. The interventions are described in research terms. They have their theoretical background is extremely exciting. And the third thing and last that I took as a message from this seminar is how different our concerns are. We have similar concerns about the future of the world, the global environmental issues, but the social issues that we are facing are tremendously different. And you see, I'm an old woman, and when I was in my 20s, I hoped it would be not the case by the time I retire. I have not yet retired, but I don't think East and West will come closer in terms of social problems. Speaking from a country where there are 3 million people beyond the poverty line, I really envy some of your problems as we are fighting basic sustenance and life issues. And as I said before, I really appreciate the arts-based interventions that you showed that may help us make the situation a bit better.
Thank you, Andrea. Lovely reflection. And just a note, I enjoyed your presentation, pointing out fashion design, not only the practice of fashion, but all kinds of systemic things that are around, and from the opinion leaders to these kind of very visual things like these events where people come with their beautiful dresses that show how it can be part of this kind of messaging on what is meaningful and what is not. And just coming back to my environment, department design, where we have a very strong fashion education, and how we see how the students today actually underline in their work so many things that are in just like diversity, inclusion, just to start with those and continue with material sustainability related things.
Thank you. That I appreciate a lot, because when I heard you talk, I said, oh my God, I am off the program. And apparently not. We have found our commonalities.
Yes. So thanks a lot. And should we, are there questions or comments that you want to continue with? We have some 15 minutes. Daniel, do you want to take the stage and reflect on what you wrote on the chat a little bit, so that everyone can maybe.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry about my bad English. So I'm a geographer and I'm in Portugal now. So I'm not turning on my camera because my internet's not good. But I keep reflecting on this creative practice towards sustainability, and how could we just, co-construct this knowledge, this plural knowledge in a just manner, in like putting together all the plurality of knowledge and accepting all the knowledge that have in this world. So I'm now doing my PhD and trying to understand a little bit of the ecological imbalance of this place, Lagoa de Albufeira in Portugal. But yeah, it's about this nexus of power and knowledge, because when I've been working for the last 2.5 years with local small scale fisher community, trying to co-construct some common knowledge, and we've come out with a lot of products, but it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, if we are trying to make this really, really fair. And so I just think, if on your practices and in mine, we sometimes don't come up with some top-down approaches, in a sense that, is this what the community wants? Is this what they think is the best way to deal with sustainability? Or do we come with our practice and our academic view of the world, and just say to them, okay, this is how we need to handle sustainability issues, or if we come and give them the space and to think what they want for the future. I mean, what it's the best future for them, what's sustainability for them. I guess it's a little bit about that, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. Really good reflections, and at least for me, brings a lot of thoughts into my mind. Someone wants to continue. Lara, please.
I think that's really interesting what you say, Daniel, and it relates, I think, to both of the projects, because there's this question about, you're talking about justice, and that's such a situated practice, like what that means is going to be really contextual and different for different situations. And we've got this tension in our projects where we really want to figure out ways of doing things that are shareable or replicable, or we have some sense that they work in a certain way, yet we're sort of also wanting to leave them open, because we're really interested in power dynamics and how to kind of how do we do this work where we leave things open in this kind of participatory manner, yet have enough of a structure to kind of make it shareable, because of course sustainability challenges are on a planetary scale, and really we want to go beyond specific local interventions if we can, because they are going to have different, hopefully bigger impacts. And this is something that we've done a bit of thinking about in the Creatures project, and we've written a paper about it that we could share in the chat, because we've noticed that creative practices are really good at creating these kind of permeable structures that can be apprehended. And lots of our different projects have approached that question in different ways. So one project kind of designs this viral sort of scaling mechanism into itself, where you get help to establish a peer support system for yourself. And then part of your role is to help the people that are supporting you to be supported. And yet there are also other ways that this project reiterates its kind of own framing. So it says, well, how can we encounter people that are different from us? Well, we're actually going to leave certain aspects of the project open so that when we meet a different group of people, we can be kind of reiterated. So I think for us, there are some very interesting ways of kind of proliferating without this idea of scaling, that there should be like this top-down process, like a recipe, and really you must follow all these steps to get this cake at the end. But this much more kind of porous way of saying, well, these 10 flavors really work well together, but it's actually up to you to improvise in that situation to create kind of best fits within particular situations. So I think for me, that's one of the most impactful things, one of the most kind of immediate things that creative practitioners were sort of showing us how to do well. And I think we sort of lack a language here, because maybe we have some very normative models that are kind of control oriented, that are sort of saying, well, we need to be able to sort of see these structures of sameness. We need to have ways that evaluate that are the same, and kind of how do we move one step on? And I think it was really interesting. One of the decision makers that we kind of have had discussions with comes from international development. And they have, I think, in that space, a really sophisticated take on kind of interventions and outcomes, where they're saying, well, in some cases, in simple systems, you might be able to make causal kind of determinations, but there's this kind of chaotic system where you actually might only be able to put inputs in and get outputs 5 years later in this very diffuse way. So I think we're journeying with creative practitioners, but we also should recognize that decision makers are also increasing their sophistication in how to understand some of these things, and we can maybe bring together fields that have more sophisticated views and scaffold conversations between them to kind of create the impacts that we want to see.
Thank you, Lara. Really beautiful. Yeah, Joost, go ahead.
Yeah, just following directly on Lara's comment, thinking about pathways of change and theory of change and all this kind of stuff also has creative components to it. And I really like your connection to the development world, Lara, where indeed all of this stuff is pretty sophisticated. One example is that with Creatures affiliated person, Richard Lane, we are working on the theory of change of a major international development project inspired by Creatures' work, where that theory of change came about as a result of a political process of years and years of people's commitments and fights and really hard traumatic work to establish a major theory of change for this massive program. And what we're going to do now that the program is ending, is reimagining that theory of change as a sort of fun, creative exercise. So we're going to imagine, what if that theory of change was really dumb? And we just try to make it as silly as possible, but also starting with that, but also really imagining how it could be completely different if it would consider completely different people to be its beneficiaries and all this kind of stuff. So going to the heart of this sort of really hard work that people in policy are doing around figuring out what to do and how to engage with futures and sort of allocate budgets and everything, and making that a creative practice is an exciting thing that's coming out of Creatures that we'll talk more about.
Really fascinating. Thanks, Joost, for sharing. Sofia, did you want to add something, or?
No, I'm just excited to learn more.
Yeah. Maybe I share one of my reflections to the earlier, one of the doctoral students I was involved with her work. Claudia Garduño did her work on with indigenous communities in Mexico, and she brought designers into these communities in there, and during that time, Claudia uses the word double-sided mirror, because it's obvious that both of the designers and the communities learn about themselves, but also about the others through this kind of a double-sided mirror. And at least what I understood from Daniel's reflections, this double-sided mirror, its existence, it's good to recognize it and learn to use it, because that's part of the translation work that we need to do when we bring creative practices and we engage them with wider audiences, but also the decision makers and various stakeholders. We have a few minutes left if someone wants to ask a question or continue the reflection. If not, then we can also close this now. Thanks for joining this event. Is part of the Helsinki Design Week, and part of the related to that, part of the Design for Cooler Planet activities in Aalto University. But I'm really thrilled for the fact that we are able to do this online, so that we have much wider participation than if we had it in one of the lecture rooms in the university campus. So really thankful for you to joining, and thanks for your contributions to these presentations. And this discussion will continue one way or another next week in the workshop. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Julie. Bye.